A very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for the second session in the series of masterclasses by Dr. Rose Xavier. Once again, before we get into the session by Dr. Rose, I would like to lay out the hygiene rules to maintain the decorum of the session. The session is being recorded. A recorded version of the session will be handed over to all the attendees today over an email. If you have any question or you have any doubt, please post that question only and only in the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen. Please refrain from putting your comments or anything in the chat section because that disrupts the flow of the presentation. Excuse me. Also, we are going to keep our promise from the last time. So Dr. Rose is going to answer a lot of questions which were asked in the previous session. And these questions have been paced throughout the session. So there will be multiple intervals where Dr. Rose will be taking up these questions and will be answering for all of you. Please try to put the questions across to us in the Q&A tab from today's session. We will answer those questions in the next session, which is going to happen on 10th of June at 4:30 p.m. So just watch for that space. With this, I would like to hand over today's session to my colleague, Priyanka, who will be moderating the session along with me. And then we'll move on to get into today's masterclass. Over to you, Priyanka.
Thank you, Shruti, and welcome everyone to today's session. There are many people in this session today who couldn't attend the last session, so I would like to start by introducing our speaker to you, Dr. Rose Xavier. Dr. Rose is an assistant professor in the Department of Anatomy at Government Medical College, Trichy, Kerala. She completed her graduation as well as post-graduation from the same institute. She has published more than 10 national and international scientific articles in various journals, and she is an assistant editor of the National Journal of Clinical Anatomy. She has won many awards for best paper and poster presentation, and recently she has been selected by NPTEL Swayamprabha Academic Channel under Ministry of Human Resource Development to deliver video lectures on embryology. This is the second out of our 3 masterclass sessions in the series, and the topic for today's is systemic embryology. But before I could request Dr. Rose to start with the topic, as Shruti just mentioned, we would first take up a few questions that we received from the audience last time. So Dr. Rose, we would like to first do some of the Q&As from the last session. I hope you're ready for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would read out a few questions here, and remaining questions, as we discussed, we will take up in between the session.
Okay.
Okay, so the first question from one of our participants last time is, can coronavirus cross placenta?
Yeah, actually there has been no evidence of vertical transmission, that is from mother to fetus. And analysis of amniotic fluid, serum, placenta and breast milk from pregnant women conferred to have COVID-19 have found no detectable viral load as well. And due to small number of reported cases during the first trimester, risk of congenital anomaly cannot be excluded. And in China, in February, a newborn was diagnosed as positive 30 hours after birth. And the mother was positive before giving birth to the young one. But whether the disease transmitted while the fetus was in the womb or after, it's not sure. So since it is a recent pandemic, we are actually waiting for more and more studies.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rose. So should I move to the next question now?
Yeah.
Okay, the next question we have received is, does primary oocyte converts to secondary during attaining puberty?
The thing is, the baby is born with many primary oocytes suspended in the prophase of the first meiotic division. And with every ovarian cycle, after puberty, with every ovarian cycle, 15 to 20 follicles will be matured, and those 15 to 20 follicles will start getting converted into secondary oocyte, and one will become mature to ovulate. So it's not like at the time of puberty, all the primary oocytes won't be converted into secondary oocyte. With every ovarian cycle, say 15 to 20 follicles will start maturing and will be getting converted into secondary oocyte, and out of which one mature follicle will rupture and will liberate the oocyte. That's the answer.
Okay, sure. Thank you, ma'am. So the next question that I have is meiotic division arrested at which stage of prophase?
It's said that it is the diplotin or dictyotin stage of prophase of first meiotic division.
Okay, so I will just ask you one more question before we start today's session, and remaining questions I will ask you later in between. So
Okay.
this last question for now is secondary oocyte and secondary follicle similar?
The thing is, secondary oocyte is a cell with the genetic material, and it will be covered by follicles according to the stages of maturation. It will start with primordial follicle, primary, secondary, depending upon the different stages of maturation of follicle. So as the follicle becomes secondary follicle, the primary oocyte inside it will be converted into secondary oocyte. It's just like you can compare it with a mango and the seed inside. The seed inside will be the oocyte, and the pulp of the mango, we can compare it with the follicle. So as the mango ripens, the follicle is also ripening, and the seed inside will be enlarging. You can just compare it like that. It's not one and the same.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. So I hand it over to you now to take up the topic of today's session, and we can take breaks in between. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Priyanka. Okay, good evening, everyone. So we will move on to today's session. It is mainly systemic embryology. And under systemic embryology, we are planning to cover as far as possible the cardiovascular system, respiratory system, digestive system, and urogenital system. Due to time constraints, we won't be going into the details of each and everything, but you can get the details in my YouTube channel. So we'll start with the cardiovascular system. In the cardiovascular system, the important topics you have to concentrate are the formation of the heart tube, the derivatives of the heart tube. It's a very favorite question for most of the examiners. The fate of sinus venosus, the formation of portal vein, formation of interatrial and interventricular septa, derivatives of the aortic arches, and something about fetal circulation. These things you must know from the cardiovascular system. So we know that as soon as fertilization occurs, in the initial period, the developing zygote will get its nutrition from the ovum. Later, it will get its nutrition from the blastocyst, then the uterine fluids, then from the placenta. Likewise, it will get its nutrition till a better way of cardiovascular system is established. Then we have extra-embryonic vessels and intra-embryonic vessels. Extra-embryonic vessels will be in the form of white line vessels and umbilical vessels, whereas the intra-embryonic vessel is mainly seen in the form of dorsal aorta. You have two dorsal aorta on either side of the developing notochord. Now what happens is, you have two primitive endothelial heart tubes. These are the two primitive endothelial heart tubes which will be developing in the cardiogenic area. And what happens is, these two will fuse from cranial to caudal end. And you can see that in the caudal end, it is staying still separated. Now, what happens is, again, this will undergo a series of differentiation to form these dilatations. From proximal to distal, we can see that the proximal dilatation is bulbus cordus, then we have the primitive ventricle, then we have the primitive atrium, and we have finally the sinus venosus. And now it's the derivatives of all these structures which will give rise to the formation of our adult heart. And when we mentioned about dorsal aorta, these dorsal aorta will be actually, this, if you consider these two as the dorsal aorta, this will be the cranial end of the dorsal aorta, and this will be the caudal end. This cranial end will be actually communicating with our developing heart, okay, in the form of arches. Why they are communicating in the form of arches? The dorsal aorta are lying actually in the posterior aspect, and we know that the heart is in the ventral aspect. So they have to travel along the pharyngeal arches. We know that there are mainly 6 arches, out of which the 5th will disappear, and ultimately we'll be having 5 pharyngeal arches. So these arteries are actually communicating through the pharyngeal arches with the developing heart. And the caudal end, we have the umbilical arteries which are connected to the placenta. That is how you get the dorsal aorta. And this is our developing heart. Now, what do you mean by bulboventricular loop? So in the beginning, we mentioned that this is just in the form of a tube with 2 horns. Now what happens is, the bulbus cordus portion and the primitive ventricle, these 2 portions will be growing in an advanced phase compared to the rest of the tube. Then what happens? It has to actually be confined within the pericardium. So it will have to fold on itself. That is why, since this bulbus cordus and the primitive ventricle are enlarging at a faster pace, we call the fold formed as bulboventricular loop. And this bulboventricular loop, as a result of this looping, what happens is the bulbous cordis and primitive ventricle will be lying in the anterior aspect, and the atria, this part, will go to the posterior aspect. That is the reason why in the adult heart we have seen that the atria are actually placed posterior to the ventricles. Now, this is a very simple diagram, schematic representation, because at one look you will get to know what are the derivatives of each and every part of the heart tube. So from proximal to distal, we know that this is the bulbous cordis portion, then the primitive ventricle, then we have the primitive atrium, then we have the sinus venosus. This bulbous cord is again divided into proximal 1/3, middle 1/3, and distal 1/3. Proximal 1/3 will be giving rise to the primitive right ventricle. Then we have the middle 1/3, which is actually a common outflow tract for both right and left ventricles. And the distal 1/3 will be forming the truncus arteriosus, the common trunk again, which will be divided into ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk. And this sulcus is known as bulboventricular sulcus. Now, the primitive ventricle will be giving rise to the left ventricle. Then you have the primitive atrium, which will be divided into two, that is the right and left atria. In between the ventricle and atrium, you have the atrioventricular canal. And finally, we have the sinus venosus. And when we talk about sinus venosus, it has got a body, it has got a right horn, and it has got a left horn. Between the sinus venosus and atrium, we have a valve that is known as sinoatrial orifice. And with the development of right atrium, what happens is the body of the sinus venosus will actually get incorporated into the atrium, and it forms the smooth part of the atrium. Now, what happens to the right and left horn? The left horn usually regresses, and the remnant is usually seen as the coronary sinus. And when we look at these two horns, we can see that there are mainly three sets of vessels, mainly veins, draining into these horns. They are the common cardinal veins from different parts of the body of the fetus. Then we have the umbilical veins and coming from the placenta, and we have the vitelline veins related to the yolk sac. So the left horn usually regresses, and in the right horn, the right common cardinal vein is usually giving rise to the superior vena cava. Then we have the right umbilical vein, which usually regresses, and the right vitelline vein will be forming parts of inferior vena cava. This is in a nutshell about the derivatives of heart tube. Now, when we talk about the sinus venosus, another important thing which you should know, again, very favorite question for the examiners, that is the formation of portal vein. So portal vein is also derived from the vitelline veins, which are located on either. You can see the two vitelline veins. And when we look at this diagram, we can see that these two vitelline veins are connected by three anastomoses. Two in front of the duodenum and one behind the duodenum. Two in front of the duodenum, you can call it as ventral anastomosis, proximal and distal, and the one behind, you can call it as dorsal anastomosis or middle anastomosis. Now, what you have to see here is, there are mainly two veins. One is splenic vein and the other one is left umbilical vein joining the left side. The splenic vein actually joins the dorsal anastomosis, and the left umbilical vein is actually joining the left end of the proximal ventral anastomosis. Now, in course of time, with the rotation of the duodenum, what happens is the right limb, you can consider this as a right limb and you can consider it as the left limb of the vitelline veins. With the rotation of the duodenum, what happens is the right will go posterior and the left will become anterior. And you can see that the right limb distal to the middle anastomosis. This is the distal portion of the posterior limb. This will just disappear. And when you compare the anterior limb, you can see that the junction between the dorsal and anastomosis is disappearing, and the entire ventral anastomosis is also disappearing. So we can derive the portal vein like the main trunk. This is the main trunk of the portal vein, right? So the main trunk of the portal vein is derived from the posterior limb between the ventral and dorsal anastomosis, the middle dorsal anastomosis, and the splenic vein and the superior mesenteric vein joining it. Okay, so this is how you get the trunk of the portal vein. And what about the branches of the right and left branches of the portal vein? The right branch is the right white line vein proximal to this anastomosis. This portion is the proximal portion of the right white line vein, and the left branch is actually formed from the ventral anastomosis as well as the left white line vein. So that is the reason why you have the left branch of portal vein longer than the right one. Now, coming to the interatrial septum, the formation of interatrial septum, you will get it everywhere, this question. So we know that there is a primitive atrium which is divided into right and left atria by the formation of septum in the middle. The first septum to begin with is the septum primum. So first septum formed is known as the septum primum, which is coming from the roof of the atria. Between the atrium and the ventricle, you have the atrioventricular canal where you get an AV cushion, atrioventricular cushion. This is otherwise known as septum intermedium. So this septum primum will try to meet the septum intermedium. So before it reaches, so this will be actually growing like this. So before it reaches, there is an ostium formed. This is the first formed ostium that is known as ostium primum. You can see this here. This is the ostium primum. So why there is an opening? This is actually for the flow of blood from the right atrium to the left atrium. You know, in fetal circulation, we have the flow of blood from right to left. Then once this meets this AV cushion, there should be some opening. The opening from the right atrium to left atrium should be maintained throughout during the fetal period, right? So some of the cells will undergo apoptosis and another ostium will be formed in the upper aspect of the septum. That is known as ostium secundum. Simultaneously, another septum will start coming from above on the right side of this. That is known as septum secundum. Once the septum secundum crosses this ostium secundum, you are going to rename this ostium secundum as foramen ovale. And next to that, we know that there is sinoatrial orifice, which is opening into the right atrium, isn't it? It has got a right valve and a left valve, and the junction is known as septum spurium. Septum spurium. So the left valve actually merges with the septum secundum, and that is actually one more point you have to add. Now, what about fossa ovalis? So what happens is once this foramen ovale is closed once the baby is born, this region is known as fossa ovalis. So what is this structure? This is our septum primum. So fossa ovalis is actually formed from septum primum, and this is the lower portion of septum secundum, isn't it? And this lower portion will be forming limbus fossa ovalis. Limbus fossa ovalis. Now coming to interventricular septum, when we talk about interventricular septum, it is made up of three parts. We have the muscular portion, we have the membranous portion, and we have the bulbar portion. Muscular portion will be actually arising from the floor of the ventricle, the primitive ventricle. Then we have the bulbar spiral septum coming from above, which is seen in the truncus. And that will be dividing the truncus into the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk, right? So the lower part of the bulbar spiral septum will be coming down, but there will be a defect between the muscular septum and the bulbar septum. This foramen, in the beginning, you call it as interventricular foramen, and this will be closed by the cells arising from the AV cushion, and this will be forming the membranous part of the interventricular septum. So when interventricular septum is asked, you have to talk about these three important structures. Now coming to the aortic arches, I'm not going to the details. We have mentioned that this is a developing heart with the aortic sac. Then you have the two dorsal aortae, which are connected to the developing heart through the arteries running through the pharyngeal arches. You call those arteries as aortic arch arteries. So since we have 6 pharyngeal arches, out of which 5th one is disappearing, likewise we have 6 arch arteries, out of which the 5th one is disappearing. Now let's see the fate of these aortic arch arteries. The first and second usually disappear, and the remnant is seen as maxillary artery for the first, hyoid and stapedial artery for the second. The third one, this is the third one, this is actually forming the common carotid arteries and the internal carotid artery. Okay, so this is the internal carotid artery and this one is the common carotid artery. External carotid artery is actually seen as a bend arising from the third arch artery. Now coming to the fourth one on the left side, we can see that this is the arch of aorta arising from the fourth, and on the right side you have the right subclavian artery. Now the fifth one usually disappears, and the sixth one is actually giving rise to the pulmonary artery on both sides. So on the right and left side, we have the pulmonary arteries. Now this is known as the aortic sac. So aortic sac has got two horns, the right and left horns. What happens to the right horn? Right horn will be giving rise to the brachiocephalic trunk, and the left horn will be giving rise to the proximal portion of the arch of aorta. This is in a nutshell about the derivatives of aortic arches. You can see the detailed version in my YouTube channel. So fourth arch, sixth arch. Now the right horn forms the brachiocephalic trunk and left horn forms the proximal portion of the arch of aorta. Now coming to fetal circulation, there are mainly three important structures in fetal circulation. One is ductus venosus, the next one is foramen ovale, and the other one is ductus arteriosus. You have the ductus venosus here. That is actually meant for shunting the blood which is coming through the umbilical veins. You can see the umbilical vein coming from the placenta, which is carrying the maximum amount of oxygenated blood. So it has got two options. It can either enter through the liver into the inferior vena cava, or it can bypass through the ductus venosus. So the aim is to bypass. Why? Because once it enters the liver, major portion enters the liver, it will get deoxygenated. But our main aim is we have to make this oxygenated blood reach the developing brain. That is our main aim. So you have the ductus venosus connecting the left branch of portal vein with the inferior vena cava. Then once it reaches the right atrium, it should not go to the right ventricle, because once it reaches the right ventricle, it will go to the pulmonary trunk, and the lungs is not functional. So you don't need a pulmonary circulation. So a minimal amount only should go to the pulmonary circulation. So major amount of blood should be shunted to the left atrium, and that is made possible through foramen ovale. And the next one is ductus arteriosus. What is the role of ductus arteriosus? So this circulation will continue, like from the left atrium, we have the left ventricle. Then from the left ventricle, you have the aorta. Then you have the arch of aorta, which will be actually sending branches to the head, the developing brain, the heart, the neck, and the upper limbs. And it will be continuing as the descending aorta. But we know that there is blood in the right atrium, which are coming from the superior vena cava, the coronary sinus. So it will run into the right ventricle along with some of the blood from the inferior vena cava as well. It will enter into the pulmonary trunk. So this is our pulmonary trunk. So from the pulmonary trunk, only a minor quantity of blood will be entering into the lungs, because the lungs is not functional there. So what happens to the major quantity of blood? It will be shunted into the descending aorta through the ductus arteriosus, and so it will just flow along with the blood in the descending aorta. And once it reaches the lower part, it will be entering back into the placenta through the umbilical arteries from the internal iliac. That is how the fetal circulation is made. So the main aim is our developing brain needs oxygenated blood. Now, what are the changes happening before and after birth? We know that these structures, we'll see which are the structures no longer needed. We have the umbilical vessels. So once the baby is born, we don't have the placenta. So we don't need the umbilical vessels. So the veins are actually, the vein which is left behind is the left umbilical vein. That will be actually becoming the ligamentum teres. You can see this as the ligamentum. This is the left umbilical vein which is left behind. That will be becoming the ligamentum teres. Then the arteries. What happens to the umbilical arteries? These are the two umbilical arteries. The proximal portion will be becoming the superior vesical artery, which is supplying the bladder, and the distal portion will be becoming the medial umbilical ligaments. Now coming to the ductus venosus, which is connecting the portal vein with the inferior vena cava, that will be actually seen as ligamentum venosum. Then you have the foramen ovale here, which will be seen as fossa ovalis when you look from the right side, and you can see the same as a lunate impression when you look from the left side of the atrium. Now the ductus arteriosus will be here, which was shunting the blood from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta, will be seen as ligamentum arteriosum. And this is actually one of the specimens, fetal specimens, which I have dissected during my PG period. This fetus was roughly about the age of 28 weeks. It was a stillborn fetus. You can see the heart. The lung is too small because since it was a stillborn fetus, the lung was not functional. That's the reason why you get such a disparity. And you can see the pulmonary trunk, the aorta with the major branches. Now you should know about something about the Fallot's tetralogy. It is actually cyanotic heart disease, usually associated with trisomies like trisomy 21, Down syndrome, Edward Patau. So all these syndromes are seen associated with the Fallot's tetralogy, and the 4 components are, these are favorite questions, like you have the pulmonary stenosis, you have the right ventricular hypertrophy, you have the ventricular septal defect, and overriding of aorta. So at this moment, you should know what do you mean by Fallot's pentology. Pentology means all these 4 factors plus ASD, atrial septal defect, you call it as pentology. And what do you mean by trilogy? Trilogy means you have the atrial septal defect, then you have the right ventricular hypertrophy, and you have the pulmonary stenosis. Atrial septal defect, right ventricular hypertrophy, and pulmonary stenosis. This is what is meant by trilogy. And this is again another fetal specimen which I have come across during my PG period. You can see that, you can imagine the size. This heart is actually sitting at the fingertips. So you can just imagine the size of the fetal heart. And this is a condition known as common truncus arteriosus. This trunk is actually common for both the ventricles because there is no spiral septum formed. And this is actually, there is only one single outflow tract. It will be usually associated with ventricular septal defect because we know that if the spiral septum is not coming down, the interventricular septum will also won't be formed. That is why we get ventricular septal defect. So Priyanka, we can have the next set of questions.
Yes, Dr. Rose, thank you. So it's time to address some more questions now. First, I will ask you this one question, Dr. Rose, which is asked uniformly by majority of the students. So here they have asked you to explain the significance of polar body.
Actually, polar bodies are small haploid cells which are formed during oogenesis, and they don't have the capacity to get fertilized because most of the cytoplasm will be segregated to one daughter cell which becomes the mature ovum. And the polar bodies get only a limited amount of cytoplasm, and they usually die soon after it is formed by the process of apoptosis. And you might have heard about polar body twinning. This happens when this polar body is fertilized by the sperm. But again, even though fertilization occurs, the zygote will die fast because there is no cytoplasm which can be provided by the polar body in order for the survival of the developing embryo. And they serve to eliminate, polar bodies are actually meant to eliminate 1/2 of the diploid chromosome set. That is the only function which was actually attributed to this polar body. And there is one important applied aspect for the polar body. In pre-implantation genetic screening, the polar body biopsies are done to predict the viability and pregnancy chance of the developing oocyte. So if you are interested, you can read about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and polar body specimen taken for biopsy. So that's it. Any more questions?
Thank you. So I'll read one more question for this break. Okay. This question is, when does the ovulation take place in case of late or delayed menstrual cycle?
So whether the menstrual cycle is shortened or prolonged, we know that there are 2 phases, isn't it? So follicular phase and the luteal phase. So usually the second half is said to be constant. So if you consider, hope you can see, if you consider a 28-day cycle, we expect the ovulation to happen on 14th day, isn't it? And we hope that this part of the cycle is constant. So if you have another cycle, say, of 34 days, what happens is you can count 14 days from the point of menstruation, and this will be constant. So this will be 14 and this will be 20. Okay. And if it is a shorter period, like if it is a cycle of 24 days, what happens is this part will be constant 14 and this part will be 10. So likewise, we can just assess the timing of ovulation. So if it is a longer cycle, you will get ovulation roughly say around 20th day after the first day of menstruation. And if it is a shorter cycle, you will get ovulation say on the 10th day of the menstrual cycle. So the second half is said to be constant.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. So I'll bring you some more questions in the next break. You can continue now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on with the respiratory system. In the respiratory system, we have to focus on the formation of the respiratory diverticulum, development of lung buds, maturation of lungs, and the tracheoesophageal fistula, which is a favorite question. So we know that the respiratory diverticulum develops from, so this is the foregut, the pharyngeal portion of the foregut. So the diverticulum is actually developing from the ventral aspect of the foregut. Okay, and how this is formed? This is formed by a fold developing between the developing trachea and esophagus. You call it as tracheoesophageal fold. And these will actually try to come closer towards the middle, and they will form a septum known as tracheoesophageal septum. Once the septum is formed, this will actually separate the two lumen into the developing laryngotracheal tube and the esophagus. So esophagus will be seen on the posterior aspect, and the laryngotracheal tube will be seen on the anterior aspect. So what is the fate of the laryngotracheal tube? It will give rise to the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. And dorsally, the esophagus will be actually forming the oropharynx and the esophagus proper. Then the primordial laryngeal inlet, which we have seen here, this is the primordial laryngeal inlet, that will be the opening of the laryngotracheal tube into the pharynx. Now, the development of lung buds, we can say it in two phases. The first thing is we should know how the lung buds are formed, the bronchi are formed. The next phase, we should know how these are getting matured. So the first one, the development of lung buds, they will be actually forming first the two principal or primary bronchial buds. Along with this, there are two canals. In the last session, I have mentioned about two canals, pericardio-peritoneal canals, which are lying on either side, which are further divided into pericardial cavity, pleural cavity, and peritoneal cavity. And these lung buds will be invaginating into the pleural cavity, so that you have the pleural cavities developing alongside with the development of the primary bronchial buds. Later, what happens is you have the right and left bronchial buds, which are further dividing into, on the right side, we have the right upper, middle, and lower lobes. And on the left side, we have usually we get the left upper and lower lobes. Sometimes there may be variations as well. Now, it's time for the maturation of lungs. So it is said that during the first 6 to 16 weeks, we have a stage known as pseudoglandular stage, where you have the ciliated cells and secretory cells developing. Now it is followed by canalicular phase, which extends from 16 to 26 weeks, and it is in this phase that we have the type 1 and type 2 pneumocytes formed. In the terminal sac period, the terminal part of the canals will be forming sac-like expansions, and this usually happens between 26 weeks to birth. And this is the point where you get the production of surfactant and the storage of surfactant. That is the reason why we usually call the 7th month as the viable period of fetus, so that the lungs will produce surfactant, which is necessary for the proper functioning of the lungs. And the final stage is alveolar stage. It starts from 32 weeks, but it will extend up to 8 years of period. That's the reason why the kids who are asthmatic in the beginning of the early childhood, they will be okay once they cross their 8 years, because the lung will become again mature, and they will be free of the disease. So this is just a schematic representation. We know the embryonic period is like this, then it extends to pseudoglandular, then it becomes canalized, then becomes saccular, and finally the alveolar stage. Now we should know some of the applied aspects of the septum form, the tracheoesophageal septum. If it is not properly formed, it results in a condition known as tracheoesophageal fistula. There are many different combinations of tracheoesophageal fistula. Here what we notice, we know that the trachea is having a common structure. The defect is mainly for the esophagus, which is actually forming a fistula with the trachea. So the most common type is said to be this one, where the proximal end of the esophagus is blind, whereas the distal end will be communicating with the trachea to form the fistula. The next type is both the ends of the esophagus are atretic, that is atresia of the entire esophagus. There is no communication with the esophagus, with the foregut, or with the trachea. In this type, this is known as H type. H type means the esophagus is communicating with the trachea through a common portal, that is the proximal segment and distal segment of the esophagus is communicating through a common point. Whereas in this type, we can see that the proximal segment is communicating with the trachea, whereas the distal segment is having a blind end. And in this type, again, the proximal and distal segment of the esophagus are communicating with trachea like this, but they are actually communicating separately. That is the difference. So, Priyanka, we can go for the next set of questions.
Yes, so the first question here is, what is the difference between spermatozoa and sperm?
Actually, the word sperm is derived from a Greek word known as sperma, which means seed. And the sperm is actually meant to mention the male gamete. And spermatozoa is actually the motile sperm with its tail. But we usually won't say spermatozoa, we usually say it as sperm only. But when we talk about the correct terminologies, the sperm means the male gamete, and the motile male gamete, motile sperm, is actually known as spermatozoa.
Okay, so the next is, can you please explain the two spermatogonia types and their functions? Are these both involved in production of primary spermatocyte?
Okay, when we talk about spermatogonia, actually the undifferentiated spermatogonia will be actually forming mainly two types of spermatogonia. That is type A dark type with the dark nuclei and type A pale type with the pale nuclei. Type A dark type is actually said to be the stem cells, and they are considered to be reserve cells, and they usually very rarely undergo mitosis. They are actually considered as reserve cells of stem cells. Now, type A pale spermatogonia actually will be undergoing repeated mitotic divisions in order to form another set of spermatogonia known as type B spermatogonia. And it is this type B spermatogonia which are giving rise to the primary spermatocytes. Yes.
Okay, one more question for this particular break. So it says, usually in meiosis, 4 cells with chromosomes are present, but in oogenesis, only one ovum is formed, and polar bodies are not cells at all. So is it called true meiosis?
Actually, we are not in a position to consider whether it is true or false. The thing is, meiosis are actually meant as a reduction, the cell division meant to reduce the number of chromosomes. So in spermatogenesis and oogenesis, our main purpose is to reduce the number of chromosomes to half the parent chromosome. That is happening in both ways. The only thing is, in spermatogenesis, with every meiosis, we are getting 4 sperms, whereas in oogenesis, we are getting only 1 ovum. So there are many theories behind. The thing is, ovum is actually developing in an environment which is familiar to it, and there is very less chance of it being rejected. And but the sperm has to cross multiple number of barriers in order to reach ovum. So we need more number of sperms. And the sperm is actually highly adapted to deliver the DNA to the egg. That is the only purpose. And what it needs is, it needs a strong flagellum and of course mitochondria to power the flagellum. So there is no need for cytoplasm for the sperm. It just needs the genetic material and a strong flagellum to carry it towards the ovum. And we know that there are many hurdles for the sperm, and only 1% of the ejaculated sperm reaches the uterine tube. So the sperm is actually coming empty-handed, other than it's just having genetic material. But for fertilization and further growth of the embryo, we need cytoplasm. So the ovum should be well equipped with more quantity of cytoplasm for the development of the embryo. So what happens is, during meiosis in the oocyte, there is actually what happens, major amount of cytoplasm will be going to the daughter cell, which is going to mature and form the mature ovum, and the other set, it will be going to the polar bodies. The polar body will be just having the unwanted set of chromosomes with no cytoplasm at all. So that is actually an unequal division. This unequal division usually happens for the fact that the sperm is actually coming without cytoplasm for the growth of the embryo, but our ovum should be well equipped with cytoplasm. So this unnatural division will result in ovum with maximum amount of cytoplasm, and that is why ovum is said to be larger compared to the sperm. And the polar bodies are actually, and again, human beings are not polyovulatory mammals. We are just ovulating one single ovum, and that will usually get fertilized if under proper conditions. So that is the reason why it is actually, depending upon the function, the meiosis is actually planned. It's not like true meiosis or false meiosis. The main aim of meiosis is just to reduce the chromosome number to half. That is happening in both ways, in both spermatogenesis as well as oogenesis. The only thing the reason for polar body not getting fertilized is major amount of cytoplasm is going to the ovum, which is actually meant for fertilization. That's it. Yes, Priyanka?
Yeah, so you can continue, Dr. Rose. We will be back with more questions in the next break.
Okay, thank you. Now we will move on to the digestive system. And in the digestive system, we have the discussions on the primordial gut, the development of stomach, development of duodenum, development of liver, pancreas, rotation of gut, partitioning of cloaca, development of rectum, anal canal, and some of the apparatus. You know, this is a very vast topic, and finishing it in 10 minutes, I'm just moving through the important points which you need to go back and read in detail. So the primordial gut is that part of the yolk sac which is getting incorporated into the embryo during the head folding, tail folding, and lateral foldings. And the two ends are closed by two membranes known as the oropharyngeal membrane and the cloacal membrane, which will rupture to communicate with the anal canal and as well as the future mouth. And we know that the primitive gut is divided into the foregut, the midgut, and the hindgut. And we will be seeing the derivatives of each. Now, when you talk about the development of stomach, the stomach is actually in the form of a tube. And later what happens is, it will undergo a 90-degree rotation so that the anterior border will come to the right and the posterior border will come to the left. And the left border will actually grow further to form the greater curvature, and the right border will form the lesser curvature. And there will be a shift of the cardiac end to the left and the pyloric end to the right, so that we get the adult position of the stomach. One point I would like to mention here is, when the stomach was like a tube, we have two important nerves on either side, the right and left vagus nerve. But when it undergoes a 90-degree rotation, what happens is the right vagus nerve will come posterior to the stomach. You can see that this will be coming posterior, and the left vagus will be coming and lying anterior. That is how you get the anterior and posterior vagal trunks. This you have to remember. Now, talking about duodenum, duodenum again was a single tube which becomes a U-shaped or C-shaped loop. It will be first facing anteriorly, then it will just rotate and will form a lateral loop. Okay, so that the convexity will be facing towards the right side. Now, when you talk about duodenum, duodenum is having derivative, it is derived from foregut as well as from midgut. So it is not a derivative of foregut alone or midgut alone. Now we know that the duodenum is actually attached to the anterior abdominal wall with the help of ventral mesogastrium and with the posterior abdominal wall through dorsal mesoduodenum. It is into this ventral mesogastrium you have the development of hepatopancreatic bud, which will be developing into liver and pancreas. And the dorsal mesoduodenum, it will be into dorsal mesoduodenum, you have the dorsal bud of the pancreas developing. And in later course of time, the ventral mesogastrium will just disappear. And then what happens to the dorsal mesogastrium? So the first thing, the rotation we have already mentioned, 90-degree rotation. Then the next process is known as fixation, because we know that the duodenum is known as a retroperitoneal structure. What is the meaning of retroperitoneal and intraperitoneal? Again, intraperitoneal is actually a misnomer because no organ is within the peritoneal cavity except the ovary. So retroperitoneal, intraperitoneal, what they meant actually is, if you consider this as duodenum, most of the sides of the duodenum are actually covered by the layers of peritoneum. But when you talk about retroperitoneum, only a part of it will be covered by peritoneum. That is what is the difference between intraperitoneal and retroperitoneal. So what happens is, once it rotates, these layers of peritoneum will merge together and will actually undergo apoptosis. So what happens is, it will actually continue with this layer and the duodenum will be actually shifted towards the posterior abdominal wall. And now it will be covered only with one single layer of peritoneum. That is how it is becoming retroperitoneal. And what do you mean by axial rotation? We know that there is a bud for the pancreas here, that is the ventral bud, that is actually coming to this region and lying below the dorsal pancreatic bud. This is actually happening by a differential growth of the second part of duodenum. So though we see it as axial rotation, I would like to say that if you consider this as a balloon, if you just mark a point here, what happens if this part of the wall is actually enlarging? This will actually just shift to a medial aspect, isn't it? Only this part of the wall is enlarging. This point what we have marked will be actually shifting. So this is actually not mere rotation alone. It is actually the differential growth of the wall of the duodenum. Now, something about the hepatic bud. We mentioned that there is a bud formed into the ventral mesogastrium of the duodenum, and it will be growing towards the septum transversum, which is actually contributing to the formation of diaphragm. So this bud, the hepatic bud, will be dividing into pars hepatica and pars cystica. So pars hepatica will be giving rise to the liver, whereas pars cystica, the main distal portion will be forming the gallbladder, and the proximal portion will be forming the cystic duct. That is how the hepatic bud is formed, and it is actually formed from the foregut near to the junction of foregut and midgut, and it is projecting into the ventral mesogastrium. And this is actually the duodenum and pancreas shown together. We know that this is the hepatic bud. We have the dorsal pancreatic bud into the dorsal mesoduodenum. Then you have the ventral pancreatic bud. We have just mentioned that there is an axial rotation for the second part of duodenum, or the differential growth of the wall, which makes just the ventral bud along with the bile duct rotate into the medial aspect. Because when we say just rotation, many of you will think why this dorsal bud is likewise coming anteriorly, isn't it? So that's the reason why many of the students have asked me that doubt. That's the reason why I'm specifically mentioning it is not mere rotation. It is the expansion or the differential growth of this body wall, which results only in the ventral bud moving to the medial aspect without the dorsal bud shifting in position. So that ultimately you have the dorsal bud and the ventral bud lying just below it like this. Okay, that is how you get the pancreas fully formed. So this is the fully formed pancreas. This is a dorsal pancreatic bud. We know that it is from the dorsal pancreatic bud the major portion of the pancreas is developed, and only the head and uncinate process is formed from the ventral pancreatic bud. And each pancreas bud will be having its own duct. You call it as dorsal pancreatic duct and the ventral pancreatic duct. But how is the major pancreatic duct formed? The major pancreatic duct is actually formed from the distal portion of the dorsal pancreatic duct, the anastomotic channel with the ventral, and the remaining and the main ventral pancreatic. But this is the major pancreatic duct. It will be opening into major duodenal papillae, and this usually regresses. But if it persists, it will be opening as a separate opening, that is a minor duodenal papillae, somewhere around 2 centimeters away from the major duodenal papillae. If the anastomotic channel is not developing, and if these two channels are opening individually, you call it as pancreatic divisum. Okay. Now coming to the loops, the midgut loop is actually suspended by an artery known as superior mesenteric artery. At this point, I would like to say celiac trunk is supplying the foregut, midgut is supplied by superior mesenteric, and the hindgut is by the inferior mesenteric artery. By the formation of the superior mesenteric artery, we have a pre-arterial segment and a post-arterial segment. From the pre-arterial segment, we have the duodenum distal to the bile duct. You have the small intestine loops, and post-arterial segment, the distal ileum, the cecum, appendix, ascending colon, and right two-thirds of the transverse colon. So there is one entity you should know, that is known as physiological umbilical hernia. That is what is in the initial period. What happens is, with the development of liver and kidney, there is no much space inside the abdominal cavity. So what happens is, it will just try to push the intestinal loops which are developing outside the abdominal cavity until there is much space within the abdominal cavity, and later it will undergo roughly 270-degree rotation, and it will ultimately occupy the different adult positions. So the looping as well as the rotation of the loops you have to know in details. Then what do you mean by cloaca? Cloaca, if you consider this as hindgut, you have the allantois attached to it. Okay. So you have a pre-allantoic portion. This is a pre-allantoic portion, and this is a post-allantoic portion. This post-allantoic portion is known as cloaca. This is actually divided by the urorectal septum into an anterior portion as well as a posterior portion. The anterior portion is known as urogenital sinus, which will be forming the urinary bladder and the associated structures, and the posterior portion will be actually forming the rectum. So the dorsal, the rectum and the cranial part of anal canal, and the ventral, you will be getting the urogenital sinus. And this is actually development of rectum and anal canal. You can see when you talk about anal canal, the proximal portion is from the hindgut, whereas the distal portion, this is known as proctodeum, is developed from the proctodeum. You have to remember this thing as well. Upper 2/3 from the hindgut and lower 1/3 is from the anal pit. Now at this point, I would like to say something about annular pancreas. This happens when you have the ventral pancreatic bud divided into two, and this will actually go around the duodenum and it will fuse with the dorsal pancreatic bud, so that it will form a ring around the developing duodenum. That condition is known as annular pancreas, and it will sometimes result in obstruction of the second part of duodenum. And these are different forms of imperforate anus, persistent anal membrane, stenosed anal canal. You might get undeveloped anal pit, and sometimes there will be a gap where there is no communication between the rectum and the anal canal. Now, another condition is known as congenital aganglionic megacolon. It's otherwise known as Hirschsprung disease. In this condition, what happens is there will be absence of parasympathetic ganglionic cells. It can be seen anywhere, but most commonly seen in the rectum. So what happens is there won't be any dilatation at this segment, but the proximal portion will get dilated or distended. And it is usually said to be failure due to failure of migration of neural crest cells. So Priyanka, we can go for the next set.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. So considering the time in hand, I will read just one question here to you.
Okay.
So this student asked that I have read that 3 to 4 Graafian follicles develop during one ovarian cycle, but most of the times one of them ruptures. So what happens to the others?
The thing is, ovarian follicles, only one will become the Graafian follicle, which will be ovulating. And after ovulation, the remaining part of the Graafian follicle will become corpus luteum, and finally it will become corpus albicans. The remaining follicles which didn't make up to the point of Graafian follicle will just undergo atresia, and they will be known as atretic follicles.
Yes. So you can continue with your presentation.
Okay. Now coming to the urogenital system, it's development of kidney, the urinary bladder, genital ducts, gonads, testes, and vagina, and some of the developmental anomalies. We know that the kidney is developed from the pronephros, mesonephros, and metanephros. Pronephros is rudimentary, mesonephros is functioning only during early fetal period, and metanephros is the permanent kidney. We know that when we talk about the development of kidney, there are mainly two systems of development. That is, one is a collecting system and the other one is excretory system. So you have the ureteric bud coming from the mesonephric duct, that will be resulting in the formation of the collecting system. That is the ureter, the pelvis, major and minor calyces, and the collecting tubules. And the excretory system is actually formed from the metanephric blastema. And that will be giving rise to the nephrons, the proximal convoluted tubule, lobe of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule. And the kidney, at first it will be a pelvic organ with the hilum facing anteriorly, and later what happens is it will ascend up into its adult position, the lumbar region, and finally the hilum will be facing anteromedially. And coming to the urogenital sinus, which we have already mentioned, the upper part will be forming the urinary bladder. This is the upper part which will be forming the urinary bladder. Then you have the narrow pelvic part. In males, it is forming the prostatic and membranous urethra, and we have the phallic part. Coming to the genital ducts, we have the mesonephric duct, or otherwise known as Wolffian duct, and the paramesonephric duct, otherwise known as Mullerian duct. Mullerian duct, if there are no male hormones, it will ultimately result in the formation of ducts concerned with females, whereas the Wolffian duct will result in the formation of duct system of males. We have the epididymis, testis, vas deferens. Testis is the male gonad, epididymis, vas deferens, and seminal vesicles from the male ducts, whereas we have the oviduct, the uterus, and the cervix derived from the paramesonephric duct. So these are just the primordial germ cells going to the developing gonads. And we have the testis formed in the developing the region of the undifferentiated gonad. The primordial germ cells will reach and they will form sex cords, where these will get incorporated, and these sex cords will later canalize to form the seminiferous tubules. Likewise, if it is in case of ovary, the primordial germ cells will be actually surrounded by the ovarian follicles, and that will ultimately result in the formation of ovary. And the paramesonephric ducts actually will fuse in the midline, and the unfused portion will be forming the uterine tube, and the fused portion will be forming the uterus and the upper part of vagina. So when you talk about vagina, it has got two sources. The fornices of the vagina will be developing from the lower portion of the paramesonephric duct, whereas the lower part of vagina will be forming from the sino-vaginal bulb of the urogenital sinus. Now coming to the descent of testes, the testes will be in the inguinal region somewhere around the 4th month, and it will travel through the inguinal canal from 7 to 8 months, and it will be in the scrotum at the time of birth or soon after birth. These are some of the various anomalies of the renal development. We can see the lower poles fused in case of horseshoe kidney, and the further ascent of the kidney is actually hindered by the inferior mesenteric artery. Then we have the cake shape when both are fused together. Then if it is staying in the pelvic region, we call it as pelvic kidney. Sometimes the pelvis will be lying entirely outside the kidney, that is known as extrarenal pelvis. Sometimes you will get double collecting system, and sometimes the renal tubules will be non-functional and will be dilated, and that condition you call it as polycystic kidney. And there are some anomalies for the urachus. Actually, the allantois will persist as urachus in the fetal period, and after birth it will be converted into median umbilical ligament. If the urachus is not getting obliterated, you call it as patent urachus. Sometimes a part of it won't get obliterated, that is known as urachal cyst. Sometimes this will make a communication with the exterior, that is known as urachal sinus, or sometimes it will be seen just as a diverticulum from the apex of the urinary bladder. Again, anomalies of urachus are favorite question. This is a condition where you can see that the urinary bladder is exposed onto the surface. This is usually due to a defect in the anterior abdominal wall, and this condition is known as bladder exstrophy. And these are some of the uterine anomalies. You can see that there are two uterine cavities. In this condition, you can see that there are two uterine cavities but single vagina. In this condition, you can see two horns, but in this you can see only one horn well developed. You can consider this as a septum arising in the uterine cavity, septate uterus. And in this condition, out of the two paramesonephric ducts, only one is getting converted into the uterine cavity with absent uterine tube on the other side. So these are some of the sure shot questions for the university exams which I have come across from various question papers. You will get questions on derivatives of midguts, development of stomach, pancreas, Meckel's diverticulum, then development of kidney, uterus, anal canal, lungs, or development of portal vein, descent of testes, paramesonephric duct, then development of right atrium, interatrial septum, interventricular septum. So if you had studied all these topics once, then the session will be useful for you for a quick revision. So Priyanka, do we have any more questions?
Yes, Dr. Rose. So we have a lot of questions, but we will take up only a couple of more questions now.
Okay.
Okay. So the first question is, why is it that IVF babies are generally twins?
Usually, in vitro fertilization, during in vitro fertilization, what we usually do is we transfer 2 more embryos into the womb. So it is the general protocol is, if it is the lady is less than 35 years of age, we will transfer 1 to 2 embryos, or if it is more than 40 years of age, we will transfer at least 5 embryos. The aim is we think that at least one of them will actually survive in the uterine cavity. So sometimes what usually happens is, if we implant 2 embryos, both of them will survive and it will result in twins. There are conditions where all the 5 embryos have survived, and there are conditions where none of them have survived. And sometimes what happens is, one of the embryo which got survived will replicate and it will result in identical twins as well. So that is the reason we are not actually transferring only single embryo after in vitro fertilization. That is the reason why we get twins.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rose. So the next question is, please discuss about the grades of placenta previa.
So grades of placenta previa, last session I have mentioned it. There are mainly 4 grades for the placenta previa. So the placenta previa means the placenta getting implanted in the lower uterine segment. So grade 1 means it is there in the lower uterine segment. It is not going nearer to the internal os. Grade 2 means it is going towards the internal os. Grade 3 means it is covering the internal os, but when the internal os is dilated, it will move away from the os and it won't result in bleeding. But grade 4 means it completely covers the internal os, and even if it is dilated, it won't move away. So that is grade 4, and that is said to be more severe.
Dr. Rose, so I will just ask one last question now. And since we are already over with our time, so I will send you the remaining questions over email and we can send the answers to the audience later.
Okay.
So this last question for today's session is, what makes the second sperm not to enter in the ovary?
Actually, that is actually polyspermy. If second sperm happens to enter, that condition is known as polyspermy, right? So polyspermy is actually prevented by two mechanisms. The first one is due to fast electrical block on the plasma membrane of the egg. That is one thing. And another thing is known as Zoner reaction. Zoner reaction means the products which are actually released from the cortical granules located in the ovum. The cortical granules located in the ovum just beneath the plasma membrane, it will actually result in inactivation of the sperm receptors which are seen on the zona pellucida. So once the sperm receptors are inactivated, no more sperm can attach and no more sperm can enter into the ovum. That is how this polyspermy is prevented.
Once again, thank you, Dr. Rose. So we have received a lot of questions in this session also, but I would like to tell the audience that we will be able to address those questions in the next session that we have on 10th of June. So Dr. Rose, we will connect again on 10th, and we will address all the remaining questions of this session and other questions on the next session.
Okay, okay.
Is there anything else, Dr. Rose, that that you would want to cover up before we wrap up today's session?
Actually, I would like to get your feedback so that in the next is the final session. So if you please send your feedback in the comment box, I can incorporate all those things in the final session.
Everyone, we would request you to please send your feedback to us in the Q&A section. You can give us your feedback so that Dr. Rose would be able to incorporate it in her next session. And you can also send us an emailer, the emailer through which you got the link, the registration link, so you can reply back and give us your feedback on that as well.
Priyanka, one more thing I would like to convey to you is some of the students were saying like, it says maximum of 1,000 participants reach and they are not able to connect.
Yes, Dr. Rose, so we do address that issue, and in the next session we will take care of it, that it is, the issue is not there. So we will
regarding this particular issue that all of you are facing for not being able to attend today's session, please ensure that you will receive a recorded version of this session. There was some technical glitch due to which the license got stuck, but rest assured the next session is going to accommodate each one of you, and we are going to send across this recorded version to everybody who has registered. Whether you have participated or not, but you will get the recorded version of this session. So we will make sure that you receive an email from us. And apologies for the inconvenience caused. Are there any parting note, Dr. Rose, that you want to make before we end today's session?
No, that's all. And one more thing is, I'm just rushing through since we are running short of time. So please consider this as a quick revision session rather than a detailed session.
Dr. Rose, can you just put up your last slide also so that the participants are able to see the link if they have not yet registered for the next session?
Sure. I think there is some system hang. Yeah, okay.
So anyone who has not yet registered for the next session, here's the link. You can register yourself, and we all hope to see you in the next session. Yeah. So we close the session here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Rose.
Okay, thank you.